We'll get started. What's going on, everybody? Doc Danny here with Yves Gege, going to you live in the PT Entrepreneurs Facebook group. If you're listening to this on the PT Entrepreneur podcast, thanks for listening. If you want to see the video version of this, make sure you head to Facebook and join the PT Entrepreneurs Facebook group. We'll check you out. Make sure you're actually a clinician, and we'll let you into that if you are. If you're not, I'm sorry, it's clinicians only. So if you want to see the video, if you want to ask us questions while we're doing this, head over there. Today, Yves and I get a chance to talk about hiring and three big mistakes that we see that people make during not just the hiring process, but also with employees that lead to turnover. And I want to start by saying turnover is somewhat normal. Some amount of turnover is normal, especially with younger clinicians. There's definitely more of like a free agent mentality versus, let's say, like my dad worked for, the United States Army for 24 years. And then now this is his 20th year in the GS system in the same hospital. So for 45 years, he's worked for the government. And that is like very rare nowadays to have somebody you're going to see that spends decades and decades with the same company. I don't think people feel as tied to the companies they work with. I think that they see a lot of other opportunities, and that's just sort of the direction that we've trended in terms of a lot more sort of freelance work, individual stuff like solo entrepreneurship, but also people that they want to jump ship and go to the next thing faster. So there's lots of reasons why that's probably the case. So if you have turnover, I think it's normal. What we want to try to avoid is losing the wrong people. And I would say that all of us, the two of us have had turnover. And it's always a bummer when you lose good people. Like that always sucked, right? And I know for me, we've had a couple people that with our practice that left that I just thought were great clinicians, great people. And looking back on it, I made a few of these mistakes that we're going to talk about today. So hopefully we can help you, avoid some of that. Yves, anything you want to add to that in terms of hiring and retention before we dive into what these three mistakes are?
Yeah, I mean, same thing on my end. My dad worked for the same company, for 42 years and, never left. And I thought it is so interesting to see that kind of change. And I think there's pros and cons with that, right? Pros are like, if you can capture talent a little bit better because there's kind of mobility and motility there, but also obviously downside because you have to work a little bit harder for retention. But I think that's a good thing. Like, obviously we thrive off competition. And I think hopefully at the end of this live stream, you'll kind of know how to, find, retain talent and keep them around long term. Because I do think it's still possible. It's not like it's not possible. It's maybe more unlikely, but it's still possible to keep people around long term.
Oh, 100%. And I think that generationally, it's just different too, right? Like my grandparents, they're Depression era people, right? Like they lived through a period of time of scarcity, true scarcity that we've never felt. And what they experienced, they obviously, they impart their experiences on their own children. And for my parents, it was always like safety, security, finding a job that's like, bulletproof. The government's about as bulletproof of employment as it possibly, gets. Like they're typically going to be around unless something really bad has happened. Right. So, and I think that for us, like we've grown up in a time of a lot of abundance and we view things as like, oh, well, I can always go back and get a job. I can always go back and do X, Y, and Z versus I think maybe for our parents, like they viewed it as you can't always do that. Like you couldn't always, do that. And times they're just very different. So it is interesting to think about kind of where that comes from. And you just don't see it all that common anymore. And I think for a lot of people as well, they view time somewhere. It's almost like it's like a bad thing. I don't know why that is the case. It's like, I feel like people feel like if they're not on to the next thing, then they're just stagnant. And I just don't know if that's the case. And I don't know if that has to do with the amount of content that's out there and how quickly you get bombarded with information and what you see other people doing constantly on social media. I don't think it does people any favors about feeling good about themselves, but I definitely think that things were less visible, right? So you go into your job and taking pride in that. I feel like maybe it's just not as common anymore. Definitely don't feel as
No,
aligned with companies, big companies in particular, which we can get into. But let's do this. Let's dive into some of these, and then we can kind of share some relevant stories about kind of what we've seen with that. So the first one that I would say, the big mistake that I see people make is that they hire people that are exactly like them. So we talk to entrepreneurs basically on a daily basis that are hiring clinicians. And it's always funny when I'm like, well, why did you like that person? They're like, oh, because they seem like a go-getter, and they're, like they're interested in marketing, and they want to get out in the community and do education events. And I'm like, yeah, they're just like you. I guess that's maybe a good fit if you're trying to replace yourself. But more often than not, when you hire somebody just like yourself, what do you think is going to happen? They're probably going to go and do what you're doing in the near future. And usually they also don't interview enough people, right? There's one person, they're just like them. They're like, this is the guy, this is the girl. I got to hire this person. And if you're an entrepreneur and someone is very similar to you, they may not be the best employee. Like, you just got to kind of keep that in mind.
yeah. Obviously we're a big fan of reading and books, and I think it's Rocket Fuel that kind of had the visionary and integrator stuff. And I thought, that really changed the way I thought about the hiring process and who I needed to fill, because the tendency is probably to find somebody exactly like you. It's like, cool, I'm a CrossFitter and I'm a clinician and I think this way and I'll do this, and like you'll gravitate towards those kind of people. It's like, oh, this person's going to be a perfect fit. And a lot of times it doesn't work that way, right? You need somebody. If I'm more visionary, I need somebody who's a little bit more detail oriented. If I'm detail oriented, I maybe want, and a little more introverted, I may need somebody who's a little more extroverted. And so we definitely see in general, if you can find somebody who can complement your skills and provide a skill set maybe that's a little bit different than yours and shines, it can be such a good process, especially for that clear, kind of number two, and this could be an admin or it could be a clinician, right? Somebody who, can really expand your skill set, I think is huge, because we know that acquiring new skills and moving forward in your business is so huge for your growth. And obviously having people like that can really, shortcut it for you.
Totally. And especially when people are hiring that admin, cornerstone of the business, that day-to-day person that's going to help keep everything organized, your office manager, your administrative support, whatever role you want to call it. That is definitely a role that's typically going to be opposite of what that entrepreneur is. Most people, and this obviously not everybody, but maybe 80% of the entrepreneurs that we work with, they're more visionary focused. They're big picture, sales, marketing. They're creative. They get excited about new things. They like change. And if usually your first hire is going to be some sort of administrative support, not necessarily just like fulfillment support. Sometimes people that go that way, but more often than not, it makes a lot more sense to bring on somebody administratively. And if you hire somebody that's just like you for that role in particular, they're probably going to be really good at communicating with people and, building rapport with people in the office. But man, they're probably going to be awful at organizing your business. And I can think of a dozen different times when this has happened, when we've helped people kind of talk through what they should be doing. I mean, and everybody's going to do what they want to do anyway. Doesn't really matter what we say. And I hate telling people what they should and shouldn't do, because it's not my place, it's their business. But we can just kind of give them some coaching and feedback on like what we see and experience shares and things like that. But sometimes people are so locked in on a certain candidate. And then all of a sudden, 3 months later, they're like, well, I had to let that person go because they were really bad at, they weren't following up with anybody. They weren't scheduling follow-ups. They weren't calling people for their visits, or like sort of the detail tasks they just weren't doing. And go figure. It's because they hate doing it. It's not natural to them. Like, it's very hard for that person to do a task that doesn't feel natural to them. So in that role in particular, I think that assessment is great. That whole visionary integrator, I believe it's the Rocket Fuel quiz is what it's called. You can Google search this, but the book is Rocket Fuel. And it's a really good assessment of just like somebody's natural tendency. And you don't have to tell them like, I'm looking for a visionary, I'm looking for an integrator. Just answer the questions and you can kind of see where they fall. And in an administrative position, you definitely want somebody that's going to be biasing more towards an integrator.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my story, well, in a CrossFit gym, started my practice. And what I realized I was good at was seeing patients, keeping them around, building relationships out in the community. What I hated doing was any of the numbers, Excel spreadsheets, honestly hated answering the phone and having those initial conversations. And so the first person I hired, which was Dane, who ended up, basically being a business partner by the end, and the COO, was really, really good at that. Like, putting all the numbers together, looking at the KPIs, was decent at systems, but he was way better at Excel spreadsheets. And then he was taking all the phone calls. And as soon as I got that person in place, the cool part was it allowed me to go build more relationships and see more patients, which kind of got me to the point now where I can hire, a clinician. So I think it is, you're right, just that first essential person to kind of complement you and, really build a good administrative foundational base will just lay the groundwork, I think, for really expanding your practice.
For sure. And looking at that first clinical hire, I do think that you're probably going to find people that are going to be in either of those categories. It depends on what you're looking for. For me, I would say early on, pretty much everybody that I hired had some interest as entrepreneurially of doing something. And if they didn't, by the time they got a chance to be around me for long enough, they were interested. And it's just like a disease that spreads or something, with proximity to being around me. It happens. And that's not great for a practice. But it's obviously great for what we do with PT Biz. But what was interesting with those clinicians, they were all relatively new out of school. One of them in particular, actually the guy that ended up buying Athletes Potential, was probably the most similar to me. And what's interesting is I feel like looking back at it, like I didn't know that's the direction we were going to go, but he was a perfect fit to kind of take the company and go forward with it because of just like, we're very similar in terms of the things we're good and bad at. So that actually worked out really well. So if you're planning on maybe an exit strategy, that might be an option to look at. But the other two, I mean, they were not people that I thought were very much like me at all. They just were interested in clinical things very similar to what I was doing. And both of them actually ended up going and doing their own thing successfully. So, and looking back on it, I hired people that are pretty entrepreneurial in those cases. And if I wanted somebody that was going to stick around longer, I probably wouldn't have hired right out of school. And I probably would have hired somebody that had some experience. And there's a few key characteristics. Like if you want somebody stable, hire somebody that's married, has children, and a mortgage. Like those people are typically going to stay at certain jobs longer. They want healthcare benefits. They want stability in a paycheck. They're going to require more money guaranteed. Like their salaries are going to be more, but they're going to be less transient and less likely to take a big risk on themselves and move on to go do their own thing. If you're looking for stability in your schedule. Now, if you're looking for somebody that's going to be scrappy and kind of a go-getter, like no doubt you can get a lot of great work out of people that are newer out of school, that are more entrepreneurial. Like they will help market and grow and they'll do all those things. They're just not going to be there as long. So, I think that you got to kind of know what you're getting yourself into. And sometimes they can be like you. Sometimes they can be the complete opposite. It just depends on what you're looking for. And you have to intentionally hire not just the skill set, but also the person, the type of person that you're looking to bring on.
Yeah, I think the power of knowing all those things is super important, right? So a lot of times we have certain expectations and then we hire somebody and we think they're a long-term fit, like you said, but it's a new grad, who's renting an apartment and isn't married. Like, yeah, you should not expect that person to come in long-term. So I think that's where people typically get tripped up, is when they have a certain expectation and then it's not that, and then they don't plan for it, and they're there a year and they've offloaded their schedule and they did nothing else and like, oh crap, I got to jump in. So, and that's the intention of these, is just to get people to, have a roadmap, to understand what are the likelihood scenarios, and to go back what you said, I think it is a fine line between finding somebody who's intrapreneurial instead of entrepreneurial. And sometimes you need to nurture that, because I get that question a lot. It's like, oh, this person, they want to start their own practice. Should I hire them? And I was like, you could, I did that. And just like with you, I found somebody who was very entrepreneurial and ended up selling my practice, to those people. So it's definitely possible, but it is a fine line, right? You don't want somebody coming in, hanging out for a year, getting all your skill set, and then opening up a practice, which does happen too, so it's a challenge.
It happens a lot. And yeah, Scott just chimed in, Scott Jablanca, up in Charlotte. He said, hey, if they remind me a lot of myself, they won't work out. If two people have the same ideas, then one is not needed. And I think that's very accurate. You don't need two CEOs. You need a CEO and a COO, and they have completely different skill sets, right? You don't need two accountants. You need one accountant and you need a sales director. These are different personality types and skill sets. And I think when we look at our profession in particular with these cash practices, one of the things that we see is that it is not a huge barrier to entry to jump ship and go do your own thing. So visibly, people can say oh, well, I can do this on my own, right? It's how hard could this be? And I was on a podcast yesterday with a guy that had about a dozen in-network practices, and he was specifically bringing this up to me. He was like, how do you just stop people from just going and opening up a practice down the road from you and taking all your clients, And I was like, well, first of all, we're not the only industry that has somewhat of a low-ish barrier to entry, right? You could look at any personal trainer, any gym, any sort of service industry in general is going to still run that same risk. Even restaurants, man. I think back to even when I first started working with the Starretts, the amount of CrossFit and other gym owners that came out of coaches that went through CrossFit San Francisco is crazy. It's got to be in the dozens of people that have done their own thing, probably in very close proximity to where they're at. And guess what? That gym still was humming along for years and years. And it's because you got to focus on the service and the product that you're providing to people, as well as if you create an environment that people like being a part of, they'll stick around. Your culture is so damn important. And doing your own thing is lonely and it's not guaranteed and it's really hard. That's the other thing that people don't realize is just how difficult it is to start anything, any sort of business whatsoever. The other thing too is from a business owner standpoint, you need to protect yourself with, legal documents when you bring anybody on. Anybody that came on with our practice, we had what we consider a pretty narrow non-compete radius, which it depends on your state, but look, if you try to do a 20-mile non-compete radius, you're going to have a hard time with that. Meaning somebody would have to go outside of 20 miles to work as a physical therapist. That's not going to happen. That's basically moving to another city. So if you can keep a tight radius around where you're at, that's very much more enforceable, as well as a non-solicit. And what you want to make sure people are doing, and this probably will happen to plenty of people that have service-based businesses. It's hey, if you leave, awesome. I hope you're successful in everything that you do. Just don't be a dick and try to take all of our clients and patients that we work so hard to get in the door along with you as you exit. And we've had, multiple people leave, and we've had multiple cases where, in one case they did the right thing and they just did it on their own. Dude, go do your own thing, and in another case where they try to, solicit a ton of clients, which is it's a real, unfortunate thing to have to deal with. But you have to have those things in place so that you are protected as a business owner, because you don't really know what other people's intentions are, especially if they're desperate. Because that's the other thing. Dude, once they get desperate and they got to make their damn mortgage and pay for groceries, they're going to do a lot of things they probably wouldn't do in normal circumstances.
Yeah, I think you're so right. I think a lot of people think that if they put those things into their offers and their documents, it's going to deter people. But at the same time, maybe it's deterring the right people, and so you've got to protect yourself, right? You got to protect your business. And always, it's about abundance mindset. I'm not trying to limit you making a living. I just don't want you to come in here, make all the relationships I've already made, take all my patients and go the other way. Like we all can agree that that's probably not the right thing to do. And so just having some basic paperwork like that, I think is essential and pretty much expected most of the time. And if somebody has a huge problem with that, it's probably, a red flag, I think, anyway. So,
especially a non-solicit. Like I know all a
right.
non-solicit is saying is like, if you leave, just don't solicit the client base that we have when you leave. Like it's nothing strange. And those are super enforceable. In fact, I met a gym owner here in Atlanta that had basically left another gym, and he 100% solicited a bunch of people to move over to his new gym with him. And the gym where he left, they had basically email records and some social media messages of him doing this. And they sued him, and he ended up having to pay like $80,000 in damages to this other gym. And it was like over something to do with like a non-disclosure, like an NDA for years. He didn't tell me this until like 7 years after it happened. So, but also I told him, I was like, yo, dude, you're an asshole. Like you shouldn't do that. Like, that's just not cool. Like you were working there, and then you basically reached out, and he was like, yeah, I know, whatever. He was young, dude. It was like, it was years and years after he'd been in business. And he's like, it's a real thing, man. Like this isn't just a piece of paper. Like if you do the wrong thing and a business finds out about it, like they got a pretty good case, and non-solicits in particular are very enforceable.
Yeah. And we're not talking about patients still have the ability. Let's say they do have a great relationship with that clinician and they leave. Cool. Go over there. Right. Like I'm not going to stop you. What I don't want you is using your one-on-one hour session while you're working for us to talk about how amazing this next practice is and sending them emails afterwards and putting them on an email list. Right. So I just want to make that clear differentiation. Like sometimes people will leave, and I think that's fine, but don't go and try to literally sell them, and put them and take some of my data and put it in yours. Right. Like it's very clear what is and isn't, and so again, abundance mentality, but at the same time, we're also going to protect ourselves.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, if somebody unsolicited decides that they want to go and work with that clinician or that whatever, a personal trainer, like that's totally different versus you're actively trying to engage with people and or potentially taking data. Like we've even heard friends of ours that have had people that worked for their companies download their entire customer base and then starts just emailing these people. And like that is very illegal. You cannot do those things. And you might like, that sounds like common sense, but I think again, what I think you have to realize is when people are in a unknown situation and they feel a lot of stress and they don't know what's going to happen or what they should be doing, they're going to do a lot of stuff that they probably normally wouldn't do out of just fear and sometimes ignorance. They don't really know what they should or shouldn't do. So, when you're hiring people, just make sure you're hiring for the right role, you're hiring the right personality, and then definitely want to have things in place that protect you as a business owner. It's like having insurance, it's like having malpractice insurance. Of course you want that. Hopefully it never needs to be used, but you need to have that. So the second thing, which kind of goes along with kind of where we're talking about with, younger clinicians in particular that are more transient, is if you create a risky pay structure, this would be like avoid the mistakes to avoid this. The second one, a risky pay structure is going to drive people into more of what we consider like a eat what you kill model. And here's what I usually see, and some of you might be guilty of this, and I definitely was early on. It's hard as hell to build a practice, to build a caseload. And then all of a sudden you get to the point where you can bring somebody else on. You're like, oh man, I can like take my foot off the pedal a little bit and get a bit of rest because this other person can help me with these things. And then you overload your new hire, your new clinician with marketing events, with content that they need to do, with, relationships they need to develop, all these things. And all you're doing is you're sort of like with a safety net from like probably a really low base salary, you're just incubating them to become an entrepreneur and go do their own thing, because you're essentially putting over, let's call it half their salary off of risk, off of how they actually do in the clinic. And they have this little safety net. And what happens is, as they start to learn these skills, they're like, I'm taking all this risk. I've built, like, I know this person now, you've never met them. This is my relationship. And then they end up doing the same thing, and they end up going and jumping ship. And it's because you're setting the stage for them to have poor predictability with their income, which is one of the main reasons why people stay or they leave.
Yeah, this has been an evolution for us, in our practices. It's been an evolution within PT Biz as we're coaching, like in the beginning, there were less cash practices, less competition. It was less of a thing. The barrier to entry to work at Made to Move was like, you typically had to do like an unpaid version of an internship
Yeah.
for like a month or two. And then I gave you a really crappy base salary. And then maybe I give you some bonuses, and it still wasn't that good. And like, that worked in the beginning. Now, no. Now the base has got to be pretty solid. The bonus structure has got to be solid. The ability to move forward entrepreneurial is solid. The mentorship, both clinically and sales wise, communication wise, all the intangibles is huge now. And so we just can't get away with that stuff anymore, because, which is awesome, we've got to be better at business. Ultimately it's no longer about just setting up a room in a gym and just making it happen. Now it's about like, I've got to build a business that's structured, that has SOPs, that's got contracts in place. And that's ultimately what we want, right? If we want cash practices, performance-based practices, hybrid practices to be truly a thing of the future, we've got to start building these things, right. I don't want to follow, and I don't want to pick on this model either. Like maybe it's CrossFit, maybe it's personal training. I don't want to be a small version of that. Like I want to be really a model that people can trust, and a model that people want to work for, and that's exciting, and we're seeing it, and that's ultimately what we've got to do. Because the best way to lose someone is to do what you just said, is to hire them. Use your first clinician. We see it all the time. I'm going to scale my schedule back. I'm going to leave them on the loan. I'm not going to mentor them at all. And they're just going to go figure it out. I'm going to say, hey, here, go find some gyms to go market to. Like, no, like you need to structure that for them, maintain those relationships, mentor them. And that's the way to do it.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really hard. And this is why I actually think this first clinical hire is the hardest. And one of the reasons why a lot of people stay small in lifestyle businesses is because you have to do all these things. You have to onboard them. You have to, clinically make sure that they're following a certain model that you want them to work within. Maybe they need a lot of support on that. You have to help them understand how to present plans of care to people, which is basically light sales training. They have to understand like how to function within the practice. All of this you have to do while you have a maxed out caseload in most cases with that first provider that comes on. So people think like, oh, I'm going to hire an employee because I'm time poor. You're about to get far more time poor for a short period of time until they pick it up. And then what I see that it's a mistake that's hard to avoid is like, you're so tired and you're so like, you've been working your butt off. And now this person, like if things aren't going exactly like you want, it's easy to get frustrated. And if you get frustrated with that person that you bring on, like it's just not a great way to, develop that relationship. You can't just get frustrated with people and tell them that they need to go do more of X, Y, and Z, and that, like that they're doing a bad job when they don't really know even what they're doing yet. They're still learning all of this. It's a different model. So, I think it's more about putting our, big boy, big girl pants on and just saying like, hey, this is a real business. I'm going to pay you like a good salary. You're going to have an opportunity to make more money, potentially with a bonus structure as well. And our goal is for you to be an amazing clinician and focus on your patients. And yeah, we might have you get involved in, sharing your thoughts and live marketing events we might do. We're definitely not going to overwhelm their schedule. And then we're going to make sure that you're just able to focus on being this amazing clinician. And that means that you have to do a lot of the marketing, continue to do the marketing to get people in the door for them, which is what you should be doing anyway, because they didn't go to school for that. So if you just shove them out there and they become the marketer, what do you think is going to happen? Of course, they're going to start to feel overwhelmed. And then they're like, I might as well do some on my own. I'm taking all this risk. I'm doing all these things myself. So you got to really think about, can you set the stage to let them focus on being amazing clinicians? There's so many people out there that want to work in a cool business and they want to be world-class clinicians. They want to help people get amazing results and never have to wonder if that person wanted to get better or not. That's a frustration a lot of times in network, especially when it comes to like things like work comp and personal injuries. So they don't ever have that. And if they can focus on being great and get mentorship and through you or maybe other ways, then I think they're gonna be happy as hell and they're gonna stick around a lot longer versus like you forcing them into this sort of like mentorship light for entrepreneurship that you didn't mean to do.
Yeah. I mean, I just love these conversations because it just shows me how big of an opportunity. Like I continue to be very excited about the profession and kind of where it's going, because it's just like we're realizing that cash and hybrid practices are just such a big opportunity right now, right? Like because these things can grow and scale, and like we're just having different conversations I think we were having, even a year ago. And so this is also, I think, for us as business owners, it continues to be typically a misalignment of what we think it's going to be like to what it actually is. We think we can delegate and they're just going to be, they understand how to sell, they understand how to market, and we can just like, take a back seat to that. And it is not that. Like, it's super time intensive. It's super hard. Like, at this point, I've probably hired, fired and like 20, 30, you know what I mean? Like lots of people. And like, I'll tell you right now, it is very hard to keep people around and to mentor them and deal with some of the people issues. Like the hardest thing, that Made to Move is dealing with, it's like, at 5, 6 employees, maybe more now, but it's what we talk about mostly. It's like, it's really keeping and retaining those people becomes the biggest thing. And we think, oh, an hour a week or something. I was like, no, like in the beginning, it could be up to 3 to 5 to 7 hours a week of really making sure all this goes well. I mean, it'll taper down as they get more independent, but let's set that expectation right now. The time and energy, like you said, it's going to take to, mentor that person and to keep them around and make sure they feel good. Because I think you did that. Maybe, I don't know when it was, but it was like, what was the number one thing to like retain people or that they wanted out of a job? And a lot of times it was mentorship and it was guidance, that a lot of people are looking for.
That's exactly right. In fact, I got that stat from my brother-in-law's wife, she's a director at PwC, which is a huge consulting company. I think they have, I don't remember, like over 100,000 employees. Like they have a ton. It's one of these massive public accounting firms. And she told me that when they look at all these metrics and they have just the craziest benefits, right? Like I'm talking 6 months of maternity leave. You can do a year sabbatical at a certain point, and you can like, they just have like all kinds of stuff that is part of retention. And I asked her, I was like, well, what's like the thing that keeps people around? Because her whole job is she's in human resources and her job is talent retention. That's what her role is, what she does. And she was like, well, the number one thing is actually direct one-to-one mentorship with their direct superior, whoever that is. So if you're a director, it's going to be whoever your partner is. If you're a manager, it's whoever your director is. And it's funny how they structure it like the military almost. It's basically just like officer rank with different names as they structure it. And I thought that was really interesting because I totally could see that, especially if you have people that they're on this upward trajectory, right? Like they know when you work in one of these organizations, I think you can really learn some interesting things about retaining people here. And the thing that they dangle in front of everybody is the partner carrot. So in these big consulting firms, partners most of them are private companies. Some of them are public, but like a PwC is private. So it's actually owned by the partners of the company. So when you become a partner, you have basically a buy-in scenario where you become part of the company, and then your compensation is directly tied to how the company does. And they can make over $1 million a year plus, like they can make a ton of money. And they have a pension that if they're a partner, if they've worked as a partner for a certain number of years, their pension is something crazy like, I don't know, $200,000 or $300,000 a year for the rest of their life. That being said, a lot of those partners die quite early because of the stress that they're under afterward. But either way, like that's a big compensation. So they dangle it in front of these little, consulting associates that come in and they're 24 years old or whatever, and they're just out of business school. And so how do you keep that person motivated to work 80 hours a week and travel every week to become a partner? Well, it has to do with being rated, with bonuses, with these title changes, with compensation changes, and then constantly talking about the partnership track. And even my brother-in-law, when he got out of that same organization, they dangled it in front of him again. They're like, you're a couple years away from being able to look at partner. And he's like, if you made partner today, I would still leave. I hate it so much right now. And So when you look at that, it's like, okay, what can you learn from that? Well, they take, and this really brings me to like the third thing, which would be to give a clear vision of the future for your employees. Anybody that's just like, yeah, we just want you to be a staff PT, be awesome what you do for the next 30 years. Like, they're going to feel stuck. It's going to feel like it's like a dead end job. There's no change. There's no mobility to that. So thinking about what can you build in terms of, titles of different roles you want to have in the company, of telling them like, hey, well, we're going to have this role and this role as we get bigger. And this is what we want the company to look like. And to really, for them to see what the vision is going to be really important, as well as having some sort of conversation with them about what that might look like long term, especially if you have these really entrepreneurial people that maybe some sort of partnership role makes sense for them to have that. And you got to have a long runway with things like that, just like they have at these consulting firms. So I think you have to have these conversations about what you want the company to look like, make that very clear for them about what their roles are going to be and where they can, have growth and mentorship, and meet with them on a regular basis to talk about where they're at, what they're working on, what things need to improve, what they're doing well, and make sure that you're doing that on an ongoing basis and not just leaving people alone and assuming, oh, they like what they do, they're going to be here forever, because they're not. They're thinking about something else, I guarantee you.
Yeah, it's a cardinal's mistake, and we hear it in all kinds of business, whether it's, insurance, cash, hybrid, other verticals, other areas, is we don't do that. We really think people want to be left alone, but I think that's a total cop out, right? It's a total cop out of not wanting to put the time and energy, and probably having some uncomfortable conversations typically, with your employees about, where they're going, where they want to be, and what does that look like, and so, and they're ultimately, difficult conversations, but from my experience, getting through those conversations early and often will help you in the long term, just like anything else, right? Like, I need to work out. Okay, cool. If I don't work out, now I'm going to feel like crap. And if I like put in the work now, I'm going to feel better long term. Obviously, like, it's easier not to do something. So I think it's just, it's about kind of pushing into that as much as possible, and like step up and be a leader, and I think a lot of people are like, what's the key to leadership? And I'm just like, well, probably just doing it, probably just like getting there and doing it. And the more experience you have, the better. And you're probably going to eat shit a couple times, like we did, you did. Like, there's nobody I don't know that hasn't messed that up, but it's ultimately the person who's willing to kind of do that again and again that eventually figures it out.
Yeah, I totally agree. We get this loaded question about leadership, right? They're like, can you give me a leadership checklist? I cannot. I can't do it. It's such a three-dimensional chess game of what to do, what to say, what not to say, and how to make sure that you're being an effective leader. What I can say is, people that do not feel like they're strong leadership in the direction that they're trying to move the company, they will start to look for other things. They're going to start to look for other options. Yep. And they're not going to be as willing to trust the process. I think that's the hard part with people that don't feel like they are good leaders. But in order to become a good leader, I think you have to get very clear on where you're trying to take your company. Like, if you don't know, if you don't have a really concrete idea, if you can't forecast 10 years in the future of like what this is going to look like, what they want to stick around for, what they want to be a part of. Like, it's exciting to be a part of the growth of those things. Yep. What's not exciting is to just have a job, especially a job in a very small practice that doesn't seem nearly as consistent or likely to pay you, as a big clinic would, or a big hospital. And we've seen people do that, where they will leave a cash practice as a staff PT and they'll go work at the VA hospital, or they'll go to a big hospital. And it's because they feel more secure in the likelihood that they're going to get paid. See, Jose asked us, how do you implement bonuses and compensation in a clinic setting, and can you provide some examples? So yeah, there's lots of ways to do it. The easiest way, we see people will create a bonus based off of a percentage of revenue earned. We see people that will do a bonus based off of visits. I think that's maybe the easiest one. That's the one that we have done for a really long time. I like their base salary to be, relatively the majority of compensation, right? So let's say you got to kind of back into what you want people to make and that's based off your area and comparables in terms of what people are making in those settings. But let's say somebody's making $84,000 a year, to make my math easy. And you say, okay, well, we're gonna have a base salary of $72,000, which would be $6,000 a month. And then they have certain bonus metrics of like visits that they've seen. And if they're above those, and they get an additional $1,000 a month in bonus. And that gets them to where they want to be. So you could do it that way. You could do straight salary too. Like, I don't think anything's wrong with that, especially if you have an established clinician. You can move straight into a compensation structure that's 100% salary. What you don't want to do if you're trying to back into $85,000 is do like, a $3,000 base salary and then another, whatever, $4,000 or $5,000 that they can make with bonuses. Like, I don't think that's a good idea. That's really it's far too skewed on the bonus side and not enough on the basic comp. Anything you want to add to that?
I mean, what I've been seeing is you can look in your general area and see what a clinician or whoever you're going to hire is typically making, right? And so from what I've seen, the wiggle room, typically, if you're kind of in the performance-based realm, you can probably go anywhere from like 10, 15, maybe max 20% kind of below that as the base, but then give them the ability, if they really hit some amazing metrics, to actually go past that, and so I think that's a good kind of starting place to be, if you kind of want to look at it from that angle. The other way, and you talk about this all the time, and you're better at these numbers than I am, is just looking what they can actually generate, and then looking at that labor efficiency ratio and kind of being at that 33%. So you can also kind of use that. So if you know your numbers and KPIs pretty well, be like, $200 a visit, they can usually get up to 30 visits. This is what is a year. I can kind of back into some of those numbers as well, and then create bonus structures of what you think they can actually see. Because we do see some variability. Some cash practices, they want people to be at 30 to 32 patients. We're kind of more in the 25 to 28 range is kind of what we see. So you also got to consider some of that, as well as kind of what your expectations are from visit seen and, the other things in the business as well. And this is, again, just for like, let's call it a generic staff clinician, that's not a clinical manager or anything like that.
Yeah. And one thing too, for Jose bringing up in the subcontractor world, if you're doing like you say 50-50 split with contractors, that's pretty solid. It's a pretty good range. Sometimes people are above that in a split. Some people are below. 50-50 is pretty straightforward. One thing I would tell anybody that's listening to this that's really using a lot of contractors is make sure that you understand your employment law around contractors, because that is that can be a real gray area depending on if those people are if you're paying them as a contractor because they want to be a contractor and they're used to that because of like home health, and maybe they've been doing that for like PRN stuff or whatever. You have to be very careful with the laws around subcontractors. Not to go off topic too much with this, but this is actually a real problem that we've seen with certain practices that we've worked with. And even talking to employment law specialists, there's some significant things you have to keep in mind. Like if they're coming to staff meetings, you have to compensate them for that. Otherwise, they're basically considered an employee. They're technically not supposed to wear your logo on their anything. Otherwise, that's a sign that they might be employed. They can't have an actual email address that has your business in it. They need to manage their own schedule. So you can't have a central person managing their schedules either. And this is something that I know that the healthcare and personal training world are notorious for actually like making everybody contractors, because it helps save on certain taxes. But the fines for that are quite high as well. So just keep that in mind, because that's something that, recently we've seen some problems with that. And we've seen that, it might be worth it just to move those people over. If they're truly contractors, then cool. We see a lot of people that say people are contractors that are actually employees. And it may not seem like a big deal until, the IRS comes knocking and they're like, what's up with this? Where's your payroll taxes? Because this person sure as hell looks like an employee to me. And that's starting to become more and more of a litigated issue. They're finding much, much more of that because it's low hanging fruit for tax purposes.
Yeah. And I'll put my biases up front right now. Like, I am totally biased to not having contractors and 1099s. Like, I think if you want to build a truly scalable business, kind of go back to what we're talking about. If they want to believe in the vision and kind of what we're doing and doing staff meetings, coming to retreats, it's going to be very difficult for that to be a contractor, right? And so, there's certain times contractors make sense, right? Like, let's just say I'm physical therapist and I got a massage therapist that I send people to, they're going to be a contractor and I just send them new patients and I say, hey, go see blah, blah, blah. And they're kind of renting a room. Cool. That kind of makes sense, right? But if they're integrated into my model, we're kind of all working together, I'm probably going to try to hire that person, full time. So, I understand why people do it, right? It's easier potentially logistically and financially, but at the same time, what are your overall goals for your business? And we've unfortunately seen it. We've seen people who've kind of gone that 50-50 model. And once to the point they get to a 7-figure model, it starts to break a little bit because, it just, what you want to do long-term, give them the same page, gets to, they can't even come to staff meetings technically, right? Or you have to pay them for that. So again, it's my biases. I bet it works in some models. Maybe somebody could be like, well, what about all these things? But I'll just tell you, for me, and I've tried it. I just rather have somebody be fully integrated to the team, be salaried. And that's why we look at salary with bonus, because I think it's kind of the happy medium of a contractor. So you got the base, but you also have the ability to make more money. So I just like that version better.
Yeah, what do you say? Part-time people equals part-time attention. We've seen this now with anybody that I've ever brought on part-time has not stayed in a cash practice. Anybody that works with us that's part-time, we never have as much efficiency, just like quality of work, as we do out of somebody that's full-time, that's like really bought into the culture. It's the culture that makes such a big difference. And this is the thing that I actually think we have such a huge advantage with is, most of the physical therapy clinics that I've been in are not places that I want to hang out for after work. Okay. Like, I don't want to be there. And many of you probably know what I'm talking about. And, especially like corporate owned higher, like higher volume clinics, you're not sticking around. So I think that you got to keep in mind your culture is one of the key reasons of why somebody's going to stay. And it's probably the most fun part about the whole business, honestly. You being able to take your staff out to do a staff meeting at a brewery, or to take Friday afternoon and go do some activity together, or go drop in and do a team workout or something like that, or host have a Christmas dinner and give them a bonus, and like shit like that. Like, it's such a fun part of owning the business, and you got to be intentional about your culture, and people will want to stick around for things like that far more than a lot of the other things that we think that they want. Culture is more important than healthcare. I'll tell you that much. People want health insurance. There's no doubt, but like, dude, you could have health insurance and a shit culture and they're going to leave. That's what you got to keep in mind. I saw it look like got one other question here. What's your equation for setting a base salary? I mean, it's very dependent on where you're at. For me, I like base salary to make up about 80% of compensation, somewhere in that range. And then for them to have the opportunity to make another 20% off of bonuses. But it depends on your area, because we've had people that are in, let's call it like Central Texas, and cost of living is far lower. And then, they can have a base salary of maybe $6,000 a month and have the opportunity for somebody to make in the low 70s. And that's like good to go for where they're at. And then you go somewhere like DC, and all of a sudden that base salary might end up being like $95,000 because of cost of living and where the clinic is located, and it's just very, very location dependent. So, one of the things you can do is just see what other providers are making in your area, get a better idea of like what the compensation looks like, what jobs are being offered. Because at this point, we have to be competitive with full on practices and hospitals. And then you may not be able to pay exactly the same amount, but if you can get close, you have a really competitive chance to get good quality folks. And people take less money to have a better quality of life as well. Keep that in mind. So if you can be flexible with them and give them better opportunity to have say over when they're doing things and how much they're doing, and decrease the burden of work that they have outside of the clinic, I mean, what's that worth, right? Because they're going to be making maybe less overall, but a heck of a lot more per hour.
Yeah. I think maybe that's where it gets difficult too, right? Like, let's say you're got some candidates, or maybe say you're even transitioning people from contractors to base salary. It's like, it sometimes would be a difficult sell, but you've got to kind of sell it. And this is, I think, where the culture, the vision, my favorite times where we would do staff meetings and play spike ball. Like, some of the best conversations were around like how we were going to improve, the Charleston community, and how, created mission, vision, and values. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I think will get people bought more into long-term, and compensation will always matter, but maybe not matter as much. So you got to do a good job of kind of like, selling it and being consistent and providing that structure for people, but also letting them know, like, here's your dangling the carrot, here's your upward trajectory, and here's the vision. You got to kind of put all those things together. And like I said, it's, it's hard, like just, there are people who want to be hands off, and that's fine. But I think being hands-on is going to be the best route to go long-term.
Agreed. And if you struggle with the vision side of things, there's a book that I really like. It's called Vivid Vision. I think it's Cameron Herald is the guy's name that wrote it. And it's basically like one big vision exercise for what you want your life to look like. It's actually really hard to go through and do all that. But, if you can get really clear on that, and not just a little vision, but like a big vision for what your team is going to look like that's the key. And for me, like, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and with PT Biz, it's like, yeah, we help people on the business side, but what I really care about is, like, I know what our people do with patients, and I know just how unhealthy of a population we have now. And you have these smart people to get a chance to spend time with patients and impart literal, like, life-changing information, life-changing skills that then pays forward to their family and their friends. And they see that, and all of a sudden, like, the culture of their ecosystem becomes healthier. Like, that's really more important to me than anything. That's, the track where I went clinically that I did when I got out of the military to teach for the Tourette's. It was to teach this stuff. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, how do we get more of these people to work with the right clinicians? Well, they have to be better business owners, and they have to hire more of these people. And now we have this net effect where in the last 12 months, the people we work with in our mastermind saw 60,000 new people in the last 12 months. That's 60,000 new people that get a chance to improve their health long-term with really, really quality providers. We want to help hundreds of thousands of people per year. And that means that we need to work with more folks to help them hire more people and grow their businesses. So, what's the big why? What's that? You got to be very clear on that for why people are going to want to say, yeah, I want to hook up to this company. I want to ride with them. I'm going to do my thing with them, because there's a lot of options out there, and more people are leaving our profession. So you're going to have a harder and harder time finding people, retaining people. So you got to be very clear on where you're trying to go. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to keep people for very long.
Yeah. The other book I really liked was It Starts With Why, with Simon Sinek, one of my favorite ones. And it really allowed me to clarify it in my brain, and then be able to disseminate that information into employees. Because that's sometimes the challenge, like, you've got to go do your own work, and then you got to figure out how to bring it down the pipeline, which can be a huge challenge.
Yeah. Well, cool. So, hey, in summary, we got number one, hiring somebody that's just like you. That can work, but you got to make sure you're doing it intentionally, because you're trying to basically put somebody in a role that you've been functioning in. Number two, don't make their pay structure super risky. So you, as the business owner, have to offset risk for them. You're paying them, even though they may not be making that much money. They may be cost negative. In fact, like some of the bigger in-network practices that I've had a chance to talk to and do some consulting with, they might run 3-4 months negative before somebody is positive on the patient side. They take that risk, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. And then not giving them a clear vision for the future, and maybe you don't have one for yourself yet. And if you don't, then definitely go work on that, because they're going to want to see where they're going. They don't want to just be in a job that doesn't change ever. They don't ever get any difference of job or role. And you're going to have to map that out for them, and continue to remind them of that. Because if you don't, they're definitely going to try to go somewhere else.
Yeah, 100%. I think you covered it. I mean, it's a challenging spot to be in, but it's also one of the exciting parts, right? Getting to the point where you can truly scare yourself, and finding the right people. It can be amazing. So super excited to, continue to work with, performance-based businesses, and just see how far we can take this thing.
100%. All right, guys. Hey, thank you so much for asking questions today, for hanging out with us. If you're listening on the podcast, thanks for listening as always. And we'll catch you next week.